morning on a special Saturday Live on Lincoln Square. I'm Susan Demas, the executive editor here, and I'm honored that Tim Mack is joining us live from Kiev today. Tim is an investigative journalist and author, and he runs the Counteroffensive on Substack, which you should subscribe to if you haven't already. We posted one of their articles yesterday as the summit between Trump and Putin was kicking off, and they just do amazing reporting from Ukraine with Ukrainian journalists who really know the country best. And they also do reporting on the fight for democracy everywhere. So welcome back to Lincoln Square today, Tim.
Thanks so much for having me again.
So yesterday, Vladimir Putin was on American soil. He was invited by President Trump for a summit on the Ukraine war in Alaska that notably did not include Zelensky or any representative from Ukraine. Putin and Trump also skipped questions with the press afterwards, although Trump did do an interview with Fox News. And despite his promise at the beginning, there was no deal on a ceasefire. Trump also said that he would hold off on stronger sanctions for Russia and said that he and Putin had quote, largely agreed on land swaps. So although Trump rated the summit as a 10, the reviews weren't exactly glowing. The New York Times headline was, "At Trump's summit, no deal on Ukraine and no consequence for Putin." Even a Fox News reporter who was there said that it didn't seem like things went well. It seemed like Putin came in and steamrolled, got right into what he wanted to say, got his photo next to the president, and then left. So that's kind of where we're at today. Um, but before we get into the details of the summit, I did want to pull back a bit, Tim. What do you feel the message is being sent to Ukraine and to the world for the president of the United States to literally roll out the red carpet for Putin, who's an alleged war criminal? um, on U.S. soil. He rode with him in the president's limo. And this came after Putin started a war 3.5 years ago that's killed tens of thousands of civilians. And it's resulted in the kidnapping of at least 20,000 children.
Where to start? Where to start with this fiasco?
Yeah,
It is just, I mean, happened here is that the president of the United States, as you point out, rolled out a little red carpet for a dictator and war criminal and said, "Hi, welcome to Alaska. Let's treat you as anyone else."
right.
Um, the kind of large scale reaction from here in Kiev is one of absolute disgust. And I think you see this if our viewers are seeing that image of Vladimir Putin riding in the beast, the presidential limo,
Smiling.
that grin he had, that
Mhm.
disgusting grin he had, um, I think tells you everything you need to know about the results for Vladimir Putin, which who until now had been totally isolated from the rest of the world,
Right,
uh, absent China, and had been kind of marginalized and set aside and treated as the pariah that he ought to be. Um, but another thing is this ridiculous idea of having a conversation about the future of Ukraine without Ukraine present. Just imagine. I mean, I can't even think of an adequate analogy, but just imagine, Japan and China meeting together in Tokyo to divide up Hawaii. It's ridiculous. Uh,
right.
it's ridiculous. It would be condemned by everyone. It would be seen as absurd by everyone. Um, but that's what's happened here in this scenario.
And
And
I have to ask you, do you feel like the American press has captured the absurdity of this? Because I don't feel that it has, and that's why I find reporting like yours to be so valuable.
well, there's been a real. I mean, this gets into a press issue, but there's been a real problem with English-speaking press cutting back on their foreign bureaus. So all around the world, whether it's in Ukraine or in Europe and Asia. One thing that we're trying to do at the counteroffensive is to replace these foreign bureaus with some adequate on the ground reporting. And so what happens when you lose those foreign bureaus? You end up having a very Washington-centric view of the world, and taking at face value what the White House might have to say at any given time about the viability of a certain diplomatic initiative. That's a real problem because I get a lot of questions, not from you, thankfully, but I get a lot of questions about, can you come on next week so we can talk about this deal that looks like it's going to be taking place? I think any serious diplomatic watcher, any serious person who understood the geopolitics of the situation.
I should note that Tim is reporting live from Kiev, and we are hoping that his internet connection is stable enough that we can talk with him for a while because this is so important. But he is um, reporting from a region that is far less stable, and so we are hoping so much that we're going to be able to continue this conversation. I'm trying to get him back right now. And I appreciate everybody joining us on a very early on a Saturday morning for most of you. Um, Thank you for being here. This is if you missed Stuart Stevens' commentary yesterday, we'll be posting that live he did today as well. And he also has an excellent column this morning looking at the situation in Ukraine and the Republican Party's embrace of Putin, and a convicted child sex trafficker, Ghislaine Maxwell, as well, and the parallels there. It's an excellent read, and we have that up for you. Um, so we're really hoping that Tim is able to join us because there's so much to talk about with the summit yesterday. We have Trump, who um, clearly seemed taken with Vladimir Putin again, as he seems to be every time he meets with him. But I really want to hear from Tim about how this is being perceived in Ukraine, because it just must be heart-wrenching to have watched it. Hi, Tim. Are you able to hear us?
About this mess.
Oh, we
The
understand.
the the Wi-Fi and internet access here in Kiev is shaky at best. So please forgive me in advance if there's any sort of cutout.
Well, we just appreciate you being here. Um, and I know, we cut off at some point. Um, after the meeting, Trump called Putin a strong guy, tough as hell. He said they got along great. Of course, Putin is a former KGB agent who's notorious for being able to manipulate targets. And just this reaction from Trump to me seems to indicate that Putin continues to exert a lot of influence over Trump. He seemed to have gotten out of this meeting exactly what he wanted. There's no ceasefire. He has time to regroup. Ultimately, Trump's message to Zelensky was basically get on board. You got to make a deal. Clearly on the terms that Putin, is putting forth. Was that your takeaway, or what else are we missing here?
Usually these international summits are highly choreographed, right? And
Mhm.
and these agreements are ironed out, and wording and terminology are agreed on weeks in advance, and they fight over, who sits where and in
Where
what
the flags
order,
are, and
what the text is of their joint, communique or whatever else. In this case, Donald Trump just decides to wing it.
Mhm.
Fortunately, we understand what he wanted going into it. So we can, at this point after the summit, we can make a determination about whether he was successful in getting the deal he wanted. He went into it saying, I want a ceasefire. And he comes out of it saying, let's just skip this whole ceasefire thing. I'm not responsible for it. Did I ever say that I was responsible for it? That is the kind of absurd situation that we're put into, and then saying, "Well, actually, I'm not the one responsible for peace. I'm going to turn to Zelensky here. He's responsible for peace." It's kind of ridiculous. It's the kind of backpedaling that really would be normally a week-long a cable news fiasco over, this would be all anyone could talk about for weeks. But yeah, I think unfortunately we've gotten too used to having a total embarrassment of a leader in the White House.
Mhm. Well, and to that end, your old outlet NPR had a story about how there were sensitive State Department documents that were left on a printer at an Alaskan hotel about this summit. I mean, that's the kind of diplomatic fiasco that would have been a huge news story, and now it's just a blip on the radar. But that does seem to kind of encapsulate this approach to foreign policy from the Trump administration, where this is kind of the norm.
Peace is hard to negotiate, even with the most competent and wise people at the negotiating table. And usually in these situations, you have two parties with misaligned interests, and you want to have a mediator come in who can come in and bridge the gap between these interests.
Right.
One side wants one thing, another side wants another thing. How do we make it fit, despite both sides having different strategies and different interests? Um, that doesn't seem to be the approach of the Trump administration at all, which is let's just see how it goes. And you know who thrives under these kinds of environments are former KGB agents and master manipulators. Um, Vladimir Putin seems to have convinced Donald Trump that peace is just around the corner. Should he get this next little bit of the deal? And that's gonna. I think we're gonna find that the rug is going to be constantly pulled from underneath Donald Trump over and over and over again, unless he comes to some sort of actual strategy for how to deal with it. And at this point, I mean, it seems to me the most likely outcome of this, looking maybe a few weeks or a month down the line, is that Donald Trump says, "Hey, I'm not responsible for this. I tried, and you guys handle it. You guys take care of it." Um,
Hmm.
because the way he's approaching this doesn't look like it's going to be fruitful. I suspect in the medium term, what we're going to see is a Trump administration is kind of given up on peace and pursues the business dealings with Russia they had always wanted to do anyways.
Do you see NATO possibly, being able to fill this void that's been left by U.S. leadership, now under the Trump administration?
Well, obviously, the United States is the dominant military and diplomatic power, economic power in NATO. And so, them not taking leadership when it comes to a war on NATO's eastern frontier is a pretty severe blow to the cohesion and usefulness of NATO in general.
Hmm.
Um, the fact is that Europe is waking up to this new reality, and we spoke a little bit earlier um, about whether the American press has done a good job conveying the world's events and opinions back to the United States. And here is one area I think that my colleagues and friends in the American press have not done exactly so well because they're more exposed to the American viewpoint than the European viewpoint. But in Europe, the amount of generational betrayal over the way the United States has treated its friends, it's going to be, I think, a decade or more before we get back to where we were pre Trump
Right.
2.0.
Right.
And I don't think that's been properly conveyed, just how much how 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 betrayed a lot of Europeans feel about what was supposed to be their friend. NATO's promise to collective self-defense in Article 5 has only been activated once, and that was after 9/11. And you'll find that a lot of NATO countries sent soldiers to fight and ultimately die in support of American interests and American strategy. That's not being recognized. And so for Trump to turn around and say, actually, through his actions, to show that Europe can't rely on the United States as a trustworthy partner, and worse, the United States is going to hit them over the head with sanctions and rip up existing agreements. I mean, it's really led to a huge realignment in European politics. And so what's that meant? That's meant that Europe is now rearming to the tune of hundreds of billions of dollars, but that doesn't happen overnight. It takes the
Mhm.
creation of factories and companies and procurement processes and so on and so forth. This is going to take many, many years to build up. And in the interim, America is one of the few forces in the world that can step in and fill this gap and help protect democratic countries of the world. And that's where the Trump White House is truly failing.
Yeah. I agree with you. It doesn't seem like the gravity of this shift has, really broken through. And part of that is that, the political press is very focused on domestic issues. And, that's been, the case for decades. And, as you pointed out, most of the major outlets have cut back on their foreign bureaus, considerably. But, although Republican and Democratic administrations would differ drastically on domestic policy, there was a real through line in the post World War II era in terms of foreign policy. We knew who our friends were, what our alliances were, and there was a lot of continuity between administrations on that front that didn't waver. But it does seem to me that the Trump administration does represent a break with that, as he has been cultivating, this relationship. We used to talk about the special relationship with Great Britain. He seems to be cultivating a special relationship with Russia. He's also, often very complimentary of, Xi in China and dictators in Hungary and North Korea. And that is a huge shift from, our traditional allies, United Kingdom, France, our alliances in NATO. And so that has tremendous consequences, obviously in Ukraine, but can we talk a little bit about what this means overall in terms of this shift? Because, this has consequences not just for this war, but, potentially future conflicts as well.
I mean, I think it all starts with the way that Trump views relationships.
Hmm.
I think the White House, well, Trump in particular, believes all of diplomacy to be about personal relationships. If you take a step back, you wonder, has Donald Trump ever had a true friend? And does he
Mm.
understand what friendship means? Who would you say is Donald Trump's best friend? I'm not sure I could name anyone who is there. But I think, when you think about geopolitics in the Trump era, what Trump seems to think is that shared sacrifice and friendships, historical bonds of affection, is not an obligation we have to one another.
Mm.
It is leverage to be used in negotiations.
Hmm.
Oh, we worked together in the past. You owe me.
Right.
Oh, uh, America has been a guarantor in NATO in the past. You owe me. Say nothing about the way other countries contributed to that method and that
Right.
and that collective self defense. The
Or a
real problem
shared
is that
vision of the world, for democracy and for freedom.
I mean, the fundamental problem there is you were talking about the through line between Democratic and Republican administrations on foreign policy. I mean, there were many differences between Republicans and Democrats in the past, but one thing they always agreed on is we need friends in the world. The
Hmm.
world is a big place, it's a complicated place, filled with different cultures and languages, and it's better economically, diplomatically, militarily, if we collaborate with people rather than demand and antagonize everyone. That's the difference between traditional foreign policy affairs in the White House and what we're seeing with the Donald Trump White House. And then there's this, I guess you could say inexplicable, but I think we kind of all get it at our core. We didn't.
Hmm.
We don't need the evidence to say that Donald Trump has shown the evidence to say why, but we can say very clearly that Donald Trump has shown a particular and strange affection for dictators around the
Mhm.
world and gives them all sorts of leeway in ways that he doesn't give democratic leaders or countries that are supposed to be the United States' closest friends, like Canada.
Yeah.
Can you imagine? I mean, can you imagine? I didn't see Prime Minister Carney of Canada getting a ride in the presidential limo with Donald Trump. I
Right.
saw Putin. And that's really what's absurd about the whole thing. I think ultimately what Putin wants in this discussion is to
Mhm.
A, be freed from diplomatic isolation, which check that off. I mean, Donald Trump's handed that over to him at no cost whatsoever.
Right.
He wants to delay the progress towards a peace deal so that so in hopes that Donald Trump will just give up or get bored of it and move on. And then he wants to continue his war in Ukraine. That seems
Right.
to be very much the direction that this is all heading. And the question is, can Donald Trump, wake up and understand that he's getting played?
Right.
And uh, I have some real skepticism about that.
Yeah, Trump seems to really admire dictators because they're able to exert this power, with no restraints. And, in his discussions about the war in Ukraine, you can kind of see this admiration, for Putin. Well, he wanted something, he came in and he just took it. And that to him, that's kind of a hallmark of business transaction. And that kind of seems to transfer to his approach to world affairs, which tend to be far more complicated than that, and usually are supposed to have some sort of a moral center that doesn't seem to tether Trump or Putin. So ultimately, what do you feel like Putin's ultimate goal here is? Is his goal um to annex all of Ukraine and move on from there?
I don't know if you saw the video of Russian Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov arriving in Anchorage wearing a shirt that said CCCP, the old Cyrillic initials of the former Soviet Union. They're not trying to hide what it is that their ultimate end goal is, which is to restore Imperial Russia's control over Eastern Europe and Central Asia. Um, this is not at all something that they're even trying to obscure behind diplomatic language or trickery. They're saying it right to our faces. I
Mhm.
sincerely doubt that wearing a shirt like that was an accident. But
Right.
ultimately, it would be a mistake to think about Putin's aims in Ukraine to be about territory.
Mm.
It's not about a certain package of land in eastern Ukraine or even the capture of major cities in Ukraine. What offends him is an independent Ukraine, a sovereign
Mhm.
Ukraine that wants to seek unity with Europe and the West, that
Mm.
wants a democratic future away from the corrupt and Byzantine methods of the Soviet era and of Russian imperialism. They want a way with corruption, they want a way with authoritarianism, and that offends and threatens Vladimir Putin's view of the world. He's trying to restore that power and glory of the old Soviet days from his perspective. And Ukraine is only one piece of that. And
Right.
should he get away with that, should he get away with it, he won't hesitate to try to take more. His war in Georgia didn't end his thirst for additional control and territory. And his
Mhm.
war in Ukraine, whether it ends in a peace that's negotiated between the parties or not, and at any time imminently, is not going to be the end of that grand strategic vision. Whether it's Poland, whether it's Lithuania, whether it's other Nordic or Baltic countries, all of these places, according to Putin's sick worldview, fall within the Russian sphere and ought to belong to them.
Right.
That really is the ultimate goal. And, Donald Trump is just a sort of convenient character that's been added into the mix that will help them take things in the meantime.
And parallel to that goal is a weakened United States, of course, and that's a goal that uh, seems clear Donald Trump is helping him with, as our economy has been weakened, our alliances have been weakened. That only helps empower Putin and Z and others that seek to replace the United States as the dominant nation in the world.
We've alienated our friends. We've shown that we're not trustworthy, that America's word can't be you can't take that to the bank. We've shown that right now we're feeling isolationist. We're feeling like we're going to punish our friends and reward our enemies. And that's just going to mean a weaker United States in the future. Donald Trump talks a lot about strength from the position of what can I take without consequences.
Hmm.
That is the idea of Trumpian strength. I don't think that's what strength means. Strength means what can I accomplish, not what sort of hissy fit can I throw and
Hmm.
get my way because I happen to yield certain leverage over you. That's not how I conduct my relationships. And I suspect it's not how anyone else who's watching this generally conducts their relationships either.
Yeah.
It would lead to a very lonely life. You might win on a certain contract negotiation, or you might win on a certain business deal, but you'll get a terrible reputation. And as we all know, reputations take a lifetime to build and a moment to destroy. And I fear that's what's happening right now. I think there will be a long, long time until the United States, even in a post-Trump era, it'll take a long, long time for the United States to regain its credibility and trust from partners because we've shown that we're willing to elect someone like this, the highest office in the land, unfortunately.
And you've been in Kiev since the beginning of the war, and so I'm wondering what is the mood there now following the summit? What have you been hearing from folks there?
I think what I am hearing, I think the single emotion that I'm most hearing from people or experiencing from people is one of absolute disgust.
Okay.
um, that the president of the United States, the country that is supposed to be Ukraine's closest friend, the country which guaranteed in the 1990s through this diplomatic agreement called the Budapest Memorandum to respect and help Ukraine maintain its borders, is meeting with the aggressor. Is meeting with the war criminal responsible for the deaths of many, many thousands of people in Ukraine and suffering of many millions more. That the idea that he is hosting Vladimir Putin, just hosting, sometimes you have to talk to bad people, I understand that. But to have this guy, to honor this guy, to have this guy grinning like he has, I mean, shows you everything about the state of affairs between the United States and Russia. And it's a huge source of disgust and and um and disappointment in the United States, which for so many years has been a beacon for democracy around the world, and is now a sort of a signaling to the world what we're really uh, concerned with is power, the ability to take. And that is a huge disappointment not only to Ukrainians but to me as well as an American.
And it was just such a contrast with the Oval Office meeting that Trump and Vance had with Zelensky months ago, where they berated him and tried to humiliate him. And, just compare that to literally rolling out the red carpet for Putin. I mean, those are the signals I think that are being sent to everyone in the world, but must be, particularly painful, obviously, for people in Ukraine.
Recently I was asked, do Ukrainians pay deep attention to American politics? Are they following the ups and downs of what's happening in the United States? And like the funny thing is that at least the Ukrainians that I speak to, they follow American politics closer than a lot of Americans I
Hmm.
know follow American politics. They're citing subcommittee hearings to me, and different regulatory changes, and how a bill becomes a law, and they can explain that in ways that many Americans might hesitate or stumble in explaining. But the reason why they spend that is not just because it's a hobby of theirs, or they find it to be this sort of esoteric interest that they might pay attention to. But what happens in the United States, what happens in the US Congress, what happens at the White House matters to their own survival,
Right.
literal survival. Whether or not these drones that are flying in Kiev on a regular basis, almost every night, that are flying and blowing up in the city, whether those continue, whether their family members who are on the front line survive this war, what happens in the United States matters deeply to Ukrainians for the reason that this is not a game. And unfortunately, Donald Trump seems to think that this is, that diplomacy is great power politics, where you move all sorts of chess pieces on a board. Well, it's not a chess game. The lives of millions of people are at stake here, and he doesn't seem to get it. And because he doesn't seem to get these basic principles, he's very unlikely to succeed with either a ceasefire, which it seems like he's now abandoned, or a peace deal, which he seems he's only partially committed to at this point.
Right. One thing I was really struck by when you were talking with Stuart Stevens several months ago, on a live that we had here, was you were talking about the frustration that Ukrainian people had with the Biden administration because there was this sense that they were only helping enough so that Ukraine wouldn't lose instead of really committing so that they could hold off the Russian forces completely. And, there was some sense that, well, Trump is a bit of a wild card. You don't know what he's going to do. How much worse could it get? Um, I'm sure that at this point, a lot of anyone who held out hope that things could get better, that's just been dashed. Um, but it's a very human, reaction when you're suffering, when your country's children are being kidnapped, when civilian apartment buildings are being bombed, in violation of, the Geneva Convention. You're looking for hope, especially from what should have been your biggest ally. Um, Now kind of this cold reality of what it means to have Donald Trump in the White House has set in. What does this mean in terms of the Ukrainian war effort, and about morale? Because this has been 3.5 years. That just must be devastating for everyone in the country.
Disappointment only comes if you have expectations, right?
Mm,
And I think going into this week, the expectations that a lot of people here in Ukraine had were extremely low. I talked to someone yesterday right before the summit, and they told me, I'm going to sleep quite well tonight because I have no hope that anything positive will come out of it. I'm not waiting on bated breath that Donald Trump and Vladimir Putin will come to a deal.
mm,
I recall the conversation with Stuart Stevens in which I kind of described, some Ukrainians believe that maybe Trump as a chaos agent can shake things up.
mhm,
He gets offended easily. Maybe Vladimir Putin will make a mistake and push
mhm,
him to our side. I think very, it's turned out that we understand that Donald Trump can be offended very easily, but all of that offense has been heaped on Volodymyr Zelensky.
mhm.
And that's the real problem. Actually, recently, I had a friend of mine message me and say, "Hey, you know what? I apologize. I was wrong to expect that Donald Trump might be a chaos agent in Ukraine's favor." Well, not apologize, but to say, "Hey, I got it wrong." And I think that that's just dawning here in Ukraine. But the idea that the White House not being a trustworthy partner, as damaging as that is to the future of Ukrainian hosts. The idea that that alone formed the basis for Ukrainian morale, I think, ignores the kind of instinctual, the fundamental, the kind of embedded in DNA desire that Ukrainians have for their own sovereignty and their freedom, and a desire to be separate and apart and distinct from the Russian Empire, which is an idea that's rooted in hundreds and hundreds of years of Ukrainian history.
What do you feel like is the best outcome, most realistic outcome for Ukraine at this point?
Well, Ukraine isn't the you could really argue that Russia right now is struggling a lot more than Ukraine is.
Mm,
If you want to compare the two economies, I mean, the public figures that we're seeing from Russia suggest inflation of more than 20%. You're seeing um, hundreds of thousands of people killed or injured from the Russian military, more casualties in 3 years than a decade of Soviet intervention in Afghanistan, which you might recall was one of the contributing factors to the fall of the Soviet Union.
right,
So Russia, because it's a authoritarian government where it's literally illegal to speak ill of their ongoing military campaign, their war on Ukraine, it's very difficult to find evidence of people speaking out or getting fed up about it.
right,
But authoritarian regimes are very brittle structures. When they bend, they don't flex, they break.
yes,
And it's worth pointing out that Russia has already endured one military uprising over the course of this war,
right,
the Wagner Revolt, in which thousands of soldiers tried to march on the capital in order to demand changes. Um, we don't see direct evidence of that sort of discontent now, but we have to understand that, you know, hundreds of thousands of people are seeing their family members killed or returned home with terrible scars, amputations, mental trauma, and that's going to have widespread societal effects. The um, the outcomes of which we cannot readily and easily predict at this particular moment. Um, Ukraine, I think, will continue to fight on. I mean, Ukraine, I mean, for all of its troubles, and we see all of their troubles, because it's a relatively open and transparent society. We could write about it, we could talk about it, and you and I can
mhm,
discuss the troubles in the Ukrainian economy or their manpower shortages or their we can debate their military strategy, and we can talk about what they've done right and what they've done wrong. In Russia, you can't do any of these things. And so oftentimes this huge advantage of being in a democratic society um, can appear to be some sort of disadvantage.
mhm,
But ultimately, being able to discuss these things openly is a real strategic win. And for the Russians, they will only see it. For the Russian elites and the Russian political officials, they will only see the discontent when it may be too late to address
mhm,
it. What we're seeing is that Russia cannot win, has not been able to win, has not been able to succeed on the battlefield, has not been able to capture Kiev or indeed any major capital, provincial capital in Ukraine over 3.5 years. And where it's failed on the battlefield, they hope to win diplomatically. And if they can't win it diplomatically, they want to win it through obfuscation and misleading and creating dissension within the Ukrainian society. That's their hope. The Ukrainian hope is to continue to hold the line, and in the hopes that Europe will stand up, the United States will stand up, sanction Russia, and push for economic pressures to be so high on Putin's regime that he has no choice but to stop. These authoritarian regimes, they don't typically do things because you ask them to with a nice smile. They do things when the incentives are aligned in the direction that that we want them to go. And we haven't provided sufficient disincentives for Putin's Russia to stop this war in Ukraine.
um, before we let you go, I did just wanna, talk to you a little bit about the amazing reporting that you and your team do at the Counteroffensive. You do just these deeply personal stories about people in Ukraine, like the people who are doing DNA testing on Ukrainian soldiers' remains to identify them, talking with families about this spike in childhood diabetes during wartime. And I mean, even the Ukrainian beer industry, people who, are part of that, or the long tradition of Ukrainian boxing. I mean, it really is just such um, a full look at the people of Ukraine, that we really don't get anywhere else, because those stories, you can't easily find them anywhere else. Can you talk to us just a little bit about why you thought it was important to tell these kinds of personal stories, and how you and your team have been able to build trust with people there to tell them, because that's not easy to do, especially in wartime.
Well, the counteroffensive starts with this motto, which is that authoritarianism and empathy can't mix. That is, when you tell these deeply reported stories of people around the world, whether it's in Ukraine or in Syria or in Taiwan, all places we've written about, when you tell these deeply reported stories and you kind of help people far away, many times thousands and thousands of miles away from where these events are occurring, help them relate and understand and put themselves in the shoes of these democratic societies where authoritarianism is trying to uproot institutions and destroy elections, destroy personal freedoms. And when you create this sense of empathy, it creates a deeper connection and demands action, requires us to think differently, requires us to act differently, and communicate to our elected officials in the United States or elsewhere around the world, communicate to them the necessity and the need and and our own self-interest in protecting other democracies in the world, in this case, Ukraine. So we wanted to take a different style of news telling, news storytelling, where we don't do what a typical news outlet does, which is say, this happened at this time. Instead, we
Mhm.
try to introduce you to someone who went through the news. We go deep into their lives. We explain what it's like to be that person, what they feel, how they move, how they interact with other people, and then by telling the story about someone who went through the news, our most recent article on Friday was about someone who was involved in the creation of these fortification lines that have been
Mhm.
keeping Ukraine safe for the last 11 years. And this little known understanding that Putin is demanding territory right beyond these fortification lines, so that should he be granted these areas, if he attacks Ukraine again, they'll be kind of naked without these entrenchments that had protected them for now more than a decade. But instead of just telling you about this fortification line, we went deep into the life of someone who acts down and has transported these logs and has built these trenches. We tell you about this life, and by telling about this life, we tell you about the news. And the world is a really complicated place. The internet is a very, I guess you could say it's a very full place. There's more information than we can usually absorb and download. We're hoping that by turning the news into interesting stories of people who are kind of like you and me, um, we can relate better to things that are happening really, really far away. I mean, one of the things I realized, I first ended up in Kiev as a result of being a correspondent for NPR, first year of the war, covering it for NPR. I realized that the stuff that I tweeted, this leftover stuff, the color that I would put in my reporter's notebook and tweet out, things like the way that I saw dogs treated,
Mm.
um, when I was doing my reporting. These were the things that, like, people related to and connected to and were most excited to learn. This color, this extra the extra kind of dose of what life is like,
Mhm.
was much more interesting than any interviews with high profile politicians, or telling you how many strikes happened in this city, or how the front lines moved from this village to that village. Um, that's really the ethos and the philosophy of the journalism that we're creating at the counteroffensive. And that's what I hope that people appreciate and understand, a sort of distinct kind of journalism, a distinct way to tell stories of the world. I'd love it if all the folks who are following us already on the counteroffensive will go up into the left at the top left-hand corner and follow Lincoln Square. And for anyone who is a reader of and subscriber to Lincoln Square, to go up in the top left-hand corner and to subscribe to us as well. I hope that we can have an enduring and continuing conversation about what's happening, not just here in Ukraine, but in all these places in the world where it looks like authoritarianism is on the march and democracy is on the retreat. This is not something that's inevitable. This is something that we can do something about. That's something I hope that I'm contributing a little piece of the puzzle to solve it. And it's going to take a lot of work. It's going to take a lot of time, but none of this is possible without people on the ground willing to tell the stories of the places where this is most prominent and most prevalent. I really hope that you'll follow us, you'll read us, and see what it is that we're doing, because we're trying to replace, as we discussed, this decline in foreign bureaus, this decline in foreign journalism. It's become not only a problem for the media industry, but it's become a huge problem for the average American's news diet, because we're not getting the information we need to make informed decisions about public policy in the world. That is a huge, huge problem. We're not just becoming isolationists, we're being isolated from the news and information itself. That is a huge, huge problem. And the counteroffensive hopes to be part of that solution, along with Lincoln Square and a lot of other independent journalists that are trying to get out get news out from the world and bring them to folks in the West, especially the United States.
Yeah. Tim and I are journalists, but to me, the crisis in journalism with not being able to, bring you the stories that we used to from capitals and regions around the world, it really has helped create this crisis in democracy. And I really so admire everything that you do, Tim, with the on the ground reporting and your relationships with Ukrainian journalists to tell these stories and journalists around the world who know what is going on in their countries better than anyone, who have the trust of people, who will tell these incredibly important stories. So I really hope that if you don't already, please subscribe to the Counteroffensive, because it is really what journalism should be. And, these are people who are putting their lives at risk to tell these stories. So, um, I so appreciate you joining us this morning. I know you're incredibly busy. Everyone wants to hear from you today, but there's nobody else that I would have rather talked to about their insights on the summit. And I look forward to you coming back to Lincoln Square so we can continue these conversations.
Really appreciate it, again, I hope the folks who are watching this will go up in the upper left-hand corner, subscribe to Lincoln Square, subscribe to the Counteroffensive, take a look at what it is that we're creating on both sides, and I really look forward to coming back again to talk. Hopefully, we'll have better news the next time to tee off on, and if we don't, really looking forward to breaking it down and helping people understand why things are going on in the or in the wrong direction.
Thank you so much, Tim. Stay safe.
Good to see you.